Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about the Dating Game Killer Part 5. This is the story of Rodney Alcala. When we last left off, 15-year-old Monique Hoyt on February 14, 1979 would begin hitchhiking in Riverside Country. There, she would be picked up by Alcala, and he would take her to his apartment, where he would perform grape on her at his apartment. After he was done, he would put her in his car and drive her over to a mountainous area near Banning, California. In that secluded area, he would then go outside of his car and make her undress into her underwear, where he would take pictures of her in her underwear. Then he would also take photographs of himself graping her at that point. After he was done graping her, he would also bind and gag her, where he would again grape her and perform sodomy on her while being bind and gagged. After he was done doing this, he would take a giant rock and begin bashing her head in. It is thought that he put her in the car and was going to drive her to another secluded area where he inevitably was going to strangle her. But he would stop at a gas station on the way. Luckily, though, Hoyt was at least conscious enough to escape out of the car. She would escape out of the car and run directly to the police and file a report on Alcala. The police would then go and arrest Alcala for the assault on Monique Hoyt. But sadly, his mother would actually post his bail. And on June 13th, 1979, computer key punch operator Jill Parento, who was 21 at the time, would leave her job and go to a baseball game. When she did not arrive at work the next day, her work would call the authorities for a welfare check and would actually check in her apartment at Burbank. There, as many times before, they would see signs of forced entry. They would find her naked in the bathroom floor with some pillows propped up against her shoulders, positioned in the same position that the other women that we have discussed was positioned in the same way. She had been strangled with some shoelaces, her face had been bashed in, and again, there was serious bite marks on her right and left breast. But there was something different here that had not been before. They had also noticed at the forced entry point where there was broken glass that the person who had murdered Jill had actually cut himself crawling out. They did not have DNA testing at the time, but they took samples, which would actually help them later on down the road. Which will bring us to our next point, June 20th, 1979. On June 20th, 1979, 12-year-old Robin Samshu would actually go with her friend to Huntington Beach, where they would go and hang out on the beach together. She wanted to hang out with her before going to a ballet class later on that evening. And as they were on the beach, they were approached by a tall man with a camera. And he would go and ask them if they would be interested in taking some photos for a fundraiser that he had going on. The girls thought it was weird, but they went along with it. And he began taking photos of Robin and her friend. More so on Robin than her friend. He would then begin talking to them at the beach, and her friend had noticed that this man was being extremely creepy, to the point that it just made her feel really uncomfortable. For example, as he was talking to Robin, he would actually have his hand on her leg and be touching her leg in a very inappropriate way, to where her friend would grab Robin's arm and say, "We are getting out of here. You have a good day," and they would run off to her home. There, Robin would spend most of the day with her friend until it got to about the point of time that she would have to go to ballet class. She would tell her friend goodbye, get on her bike, and this was the last time her friend would actually see Robin. A few hours would go by, and her mom would call her friend's residence and would ask about Robin. And that is when her friend told her parents and Robin's parents that she stayed at the house for the most part because they got creeped out by a guy. And when she had told them about the photographer, they wasted no time calling the police. The police would actually make a trip to the friend's house, and she would tell the story about how this photographer approached her and Robin, was asking to photograph her, and how he had touched her leg and was being inappropriate, and they just ran off. The cop then asked the friend if she would be willing to give a composite sketch for the police, to which she said she had no problem. After doing the composite sketch, the police would actually take it and go home to where they would begin trying to figure out finding this gentleman that was last seen with Robin. And ironically enough, on this particular day, one of the investigators would be sitting down and be watching television. And ironically, at this time that he had this composite sketch, what show do you think would come on? The Dating Game. And it was actually the same episode that had Rodney Alcala on The Dating Game. And he looked at the composite, he looked at the television, and he grabbed his phone and said, "We need to find Rodney Alcala right now." The police wasted no time going into Rodney Alcala's residence and arresting him. And upon going there, they had found something that was kind of suspicious. They had found a key on his table that had an address to Seattle. It was actually a storage unit in Seattle. So they decided to take a trip down to Seattle and actually see what was in this storage unit. And there in this storage unit, they would find thousands of pictures that Rodney had took in the period of times that he had been photographing from the early 70s up until 1979. And that wasn't the only thing they found. They would actually look in a bag and find a large collection of earrings. So they would gather all the evidence and they would proceed to build this case against Rodney Alcala. After this, 12 days later, authorities would actually find the body of Robin. And they would find her body somewhere in between Santa Anita and Canyon Road. And they could tell from what they could tell from, because at this point, animals had began eating her body, so there wasn't much evidence, but they could tell that she had been stabbed and beaten. And then they would start building this case against Rodney Alcala. Rodney this time was arrested and held without a bail. And when he would appear in court in 1979 for the murder of Robin Samshew, he would be tried and found guilty in 1980, and they would sentence him to death. And I really wish this is where the story ended with Alcala, but it doesn't end there. The court would actually overturn the verdict because the jury had not actually been informed of his prior record of sexual assault. So they would reappeal the case and bring Alcala back in. And mind you, at this time, Robin's parents had to go through this a second time. Not only seeing Alcala, but going through the murder of their daughter and everything else. And the mother had it in her mind, and at this point it's in 1984, that if they weren't going to kill the man that killed her daughter, she was going to take it into her own hands. And at that time, they did not have metal detectors in court. So she would take a little gun, put it in her purse. And she had it completely planned out that when she went to court that day, she was going to kill the man that killed her daughter. She would go into court, she would sit down, and at some point before she grabbed her gun and pulled the trigger, she would testify and say later that she heard her daughter's voice say, "Don't do it." And she would put the gun back and let the case begin. The case would actually go the same way it went with Robin's case, and except with this time they were adding in his other records. Again, the jury would come back, find Alcala guilty, where they would sentence him to death in that August. But sadly, it didn't stop there. The California Supreme Court upheld the appeal in 1992. But Alcala would actually go and appeal his case a third time. This time he was going under the premise that the park ranger who had found Robin's body was hypnotized by the police. So they would bring in and get started for this next appeal. And that appeal would not happen till 2003. Which at that point in time, DNA had advanced to the point that they could actually gather evidence that they had gathered over the years. And what they brought to the case blew everything out of the water.